The biggest lie in motorcycling isn't told by a dealer. You tell it to yourself, the moment you decide the next bike will finally fix everything. More horsepower, a bigger engine, a higher price tag. The upgrade delivers exactly what it promised, and your ownership experience barely moves. Something else is happening in that gap. And by the end of this video, you'll know exactly which upgrade is worth your money next time you're standing in a showroom. Take two motorcycles from the same manufacturer, built for the same kind of riding, separated by one upgrade in displacement and a real gap in price. That gap isn't the interesting part. The interesting part is what happens after the sale, because the extra capability only pays off for the riders who genuinely use it. For everyone else, something quieter is going on. It has nothing to do with either bike being a bad product, and everything to do with a decision most riders never realize they're making. And it's the same thing happening across almost every upgrade in this industry. Here's the question underneath all of this. Why doesn't more capability automatically mean a better ownership experience? Picture a rider standing in a Yamaha showroom looking at a 2026 MT-07 and a 2026 MT-09. Same brand, same street bike philosophy, same floor. The MT-07 is $8,599. The MT-09 is $10,899, a $2,300 jump for more power, more technology, more premium equipment. That's not a false promise. The MT-09 genuinely delivers more performance, more advanced electronics, and a more sophisticated chassis. This isn't a story about a bike lying about what it is. It's a story about better and better for you, quietly turning out to be two different questions, and most riders only find out they asked the wrong one months after the sale. Here's the question nobody asks in the showroom. How often will that extra power actually get used? For most street riders, maximum performance is occasional. A wide open throttle, a full commitment to everything the bike can do, that happens in short bursts, on the right road, on the right day. Ownership isn't occasional. Ownership is every ride. It's the commute, the grocery run, the ride to work in the rain. And on those ordinary rides, what you notice isn't the ceiling of performance you're not using. It's the weight in a parking lot, the seat height at a stoplight, the number on the insurance renewal. Think about what actually gets tested on a typical ride. It's usually not the engine's upper RPM power delivery. It's how relaxed your shoulders are 20 minutes into a ride you didn't plan to enjoy, but somehow did anyway. The spec sheet sells you on the performance you'll rarely use. Ownership is built out of everything else, the parts of riding. Nobody asks about when you're signing the paperwork. But does that mean the MT-09 is the wrong choice? No. For a rider who genuinely rides hard, who commutes on faster roads, who wants a real reserve of power for overtakes and longer trips, the MT-09 solves a problem that actually exists. The mistake isn't buying the bigger bike. The mistake is buying it because it exists, rather than because your riding life needs it. That's the lesson hiding under this one comparison. Greater capability doesn't automatically create greater compatibility. Here's a question worth pausing on. If that's true for two bikes built by the same company, sold in the same showroom to the same kind of rider, how often is anyone actually checking for it? Rarely for most buyers. The test drive answers, does this feel faster and better? Almost nothing answers, does this actually fit the life I ride every day? Part of that isn't the rider's fault. A short dealer test ride rarely recreates the conditions where ownership actually happens. Bumper-to-bumper traffic, a supermarket parking lot, 3 weeks of rain. A showroom can demonstrate capability far more easily than it can reveal long-term compatibility, and most riders don't realize those are two different questions until months after the sale. Now here's where it stops being about one showroom. Because that same $2,300 decision is playing out in different shapes across the entire industry. A Honda Rebel 500 owner deciding whether to add nearly $2,900 for the Rebel 1100's much larger engine, stronger highway performance, and added technology. A Suzuki V-Strom 800DE owner deciding whether roughly 47 extra pounds and about $4,650 more for the V-Strom 1050DE buys enough additional engine performance and highway capability to justify carrying that weight over rocks and sand at walking pace. Different brands, different categories, the same decision, over and over, made by riders who rarely realize they're making it. Which raises a bigger question. If manufacturers build entire lineups around this exact gap, a smaller, cheaper, more accessible version and a bigger, more capable, more expensive one, that's not an accident. That's a business model built on a very predictable piece of human psychology. Riders don't always upgrade because they've run out of capability. Many upgrade because they've imagined a version of themselves who needs it. The touring version, the passenger carrying version, the off-road version. That imagined rider is sincere. The intention behind the purchase is completely real. But intentions don't ride to work on Tuesday. The actual owner does, and the bike has to be lived with on the Tuesdays, not just the someday. Zoom out far enough and this stops being a story about individual riders making individual mistakes. It becomes a story about how much of the industry is built. Most major manufacturers sell a ladder, not a single motorcycle, a smaller, cheaper, more accessible model sitting directly underneath a bigger, more expensive, more capable one in nearly every category they compete in. That's not a coincidence, and it's not a conspiracy either. It's a lineup built around a very predictable piece of human psychology. Riders will often pay for capability they intend to grow into, whether or not they ever actually do. This is also why resale tells such an honest story. A motorcycle bought for an imagined future can show up on the used market with barely any miles on it, low hours, mint condition, a price its original owner still resents. That's not necessarily because the bigger bike was defective. Often it's because the gap between the imagined rider and the real one eventually becomes impossible to ignore, and somebody has to sell the evidence. There's a name for the thinking that keeps some riders holding onto a bike that never fit the life it was bought for: sunk cost. Having already spent the extra few $1,000s on the bigger, more capable machine, it feels wasteful to admit the smaller bike would have suited the actual riding better. So instead of selling and correcting course, the bigger bike gets kept, modified, or simply ridden less, reserved for the rare day it finally gets to prove itself. A motorcycle bought to solve a problem the rider doesn't have can quietly turn into a second, unspoken problem: the guilt of an expensive purchase gathering dust in the garage. Sometimes that mismatch shows up in the garage in a more literal way. Some owners respond to the wrong fit feeling not by selling the bike, but by spending more money trying to fix it. A lower seat, different bars, a suspension revalve, a whole list of parts aimed at making a bike feel like something it fundamentally isn't. None of this is automatically a mistake. Plenty of modifications are just personalization, or accommodate height, injury, or riding style. But when the changes keep piling up around the bike's basic ergonomics or its basic purpose, not paint, not accessories, but the actual size, reach, and posture of the thing, that's often a quieter admission than a straight trade-in would be. The rider isn't fixing a motorcycle. They're trying to modify their way back to the bike they should have bought in the first place. None of this is about willpower or discipline. It's about how purchasing decisions get made in the first place, around an identity a rider hopes to grow into, rather than the commute, the traffic, and the weather they actually ride through every week. Manufacturers understand that riders have different needs and aspirations, which helps explain why so many lineups are divided into clear price and capability tiers. If you've ever bought a bike for the rider you were planning to become instead of the one you actually are, that's exactly the kind of thing we break down here every week. Subscribe if you want the next one before your next purchase. So let us take this pattern to its most extreme edge, because that's where the lie becomes impossible to miss. Everything so far has been a matter of degree, a couple $1,000s, a few dozen pounds. What happens when you stop nudging the comparison and pull it as far apart as the market allows? A 2026 Kawasaki Ninja 500 starts at $5,399. A 2026 Kawasaki ZX-10R starts at $16,999, more than 3 times the price. This is not a subtle gap anymore. It is the clearest version of the entire argument. The ZX-10R is a genuine superbike. Real chassis equipment, real outright speed, real prestige. The Ninja 500 was never built to compete with. Nobody buying one is being lied to about what it is. But think about where that performance actually lives. A track day, a closed road, a rare deliberate moment where a rider commits to everything the bike offers. Fully exploiting it is hard to do legally or safely anywhere else. Most roads, most traffic, most days simply do not allow it. Meanwhile, the Ninja 500's affordability and accessible everyday performance show up on nearly every ride, in most conditions, for a fraction of the cost. Redlining out of a corner on a track day might happen only a handful of times a year for a rider who is not chasing every event on the calendar. Sitting in traffic on the way to work, in a low, aggressive riding position built for a racetrack and not a red light, can happen hundreds of times a year for a daily commuter. The bike has not changed. The math around how it gets used has. None of this makes the ZX-10R a mistake. A motorcycle can be objectively faster, better equipped, and more expensive while still being worse suited to an owner's normal rides. And it can also be exactly right for the rider whose normal rides include a track day calendar. Unused performance still carries real emotional value. Knowing what a bike is capable of, even rarely reaching for it, is part of why people buy motorcycles at all. That is not a flaw in the rider. It is just not the same thing as ownership compatibility. And this is where the industry's own numbers back it up in a way that has nothing to do with opinion. Insurers price a motorcycle based on the exact model in front of them, the type, the performance, the risk-all factor into the number on the renewal notice. That cost usually lands every year, regardless of how many times the bike is actually ridden anywhere near its limit. The capability is permanent. The usage is often occasional. Ownership is what happens in the gap between those two facts year after year on every bike in this video. Zoom out one more level, and here's the personal takeaway underneath all of it. Every rider in this video, the MT-09 buyer, the Rebel 1100 buyer, the V-Strom 1050DE buyer, the ZX-10R buyer, bought something real. Nobody in this story got cheated. What separates the rider who ends up thrilled with the purchase from the rider who ends up quietly resenting it isn't the bike at all. It's whether anyone stopped to ask, honestly, which version of themselves was actually going to show up every day to ride it. There's one more pattern worth naming, because it's a telling sign this lesson is real. It tends to show up on its own, given enough time in the saddle. Some riders who've been at this for years describe a noticeable shift in what they actually pay attention to when they're shopping. Early on, the numbers that matter are horsepower and displacement, the specs that sound impressive on paper. Later, the numbers that matter are weight, seat comfort, fuel range, how the throttle responds at low speed, how easy the bike is to simply live with. Nobody hands a rider that shift. It's not a rule written down anywhere. It's what tends to happen, gradually, when years of ordinary Tuesdays quietly outweigh the occasional track day. The upgrade was never the LIE. The LIE was assuming the upgrade would automatically fit. Go back to the belief we started with, that the next motorcycle fixes everything. It doesn't fix everything. It only fixes what you were actually missing. The mismatch was never about horsepower or price. It was always in the space between the rider you're planning to become and the one who's actually going to be sitting on that bike tomorrow morning, in traffic, in the rain, on an ordinary ride that never makes it into the brochure. That's not a reason to stop wanting more capability. Wanting more is part of what makes riding fun in the first place. It's just a reason to ask one honest question before the money leaves your account. Not, what could this bike do? But what will I actually ask it to do on the Tuesday that never makes the highlight reel? The smartest upgrade in motorcycling was never the biggest one. It's the one that solves a problem you actually have. Subscribe, because next week we break down exactly how to tell the difference before you sign the paperwork.